Elena Blackwood handed over 2/4 for a structure that hadn't held a prisoner in 43 years. The jailhouse looked like it should have been condemned decades ago, maybe razed to the ground for public safety, considering someone would eventually need to tear through the rot, rust, and whatever else time had left festering in its bones. But Nathaniel Cordova took those 40 cents with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, signed the transfer deed without reading it twice, and left the town of Silverpine Crossing that same afternoon, faster than any man should leave something he claimed meant nothing to him. Elena stood there in the choking dust of late September, holding the deed in her calloused hands, watching Cordova's fine black carriage disappear down the mountain road toward the county line. She felt the first sharp thread of doubt pull tight in her chest, cold and insistent. Why would anyone sell a building, even a ruined territorial jailhouse, for less than the cost of a decent meal? The structure clung to the hillside like a dying animal too stubborn to let go. Iron bars on the tiny windows had rusted through until they looked ready to crumble into orange powder. The wooden frame sagged in the middle where the roof had partially collapsed, leaving gaping holes that let in rain, birds, and 43 years of mountain weather. Weathered boards hung at odd angles, and the stone foundation had cracked in places, allowing weeds and scrub brush to push through like grasping fingers. Most women would see a liability, a hazard waiting to collapse. Elena Blackwood saw opportunity. She saw iron bars she could salvage and sell to the foundry in Copperhill. She saw old-growth timber that craftsmen would pay good money for. Simple arithmetic, 40 cents invested, maybe $300 returned if she worked carefully and didn't get crushed in the process. But when Elena stepped inside with Scout at her heels, the arithmetic stopped making sense. The dog froze 3 steps past the threshold, every muscle in her lean body going rigid beneath the mottled gray coat. Scout never acted like this. Not around bears, not around strangers, not around anything that belonged to the world Elena understood. The Australian shepherd had faced down a mountain lion last spring without flinching, but now she stood trembling, ears flat against her skull. The air inside tasted wrong, metallic and stale, like breathing through a mouthful of old pennies that had been buried in damp earth. It made Elena's teeth ache. And the walls, those sagging, rotted walls, seemed to bend in ways the exterior never suggested. Distances felt off. Corners didn't meet where they should. Shadows pooled in places where no shadows had any right to be. Elena brushed her hand along one of the cell bars and felt a cold vibration pass through the rusted metal, as if the building itself were alive with something unseen. Scout pressed hard against her leg and gave a low, uneasy whine that Elena hadn't heard since the dog was a pup caught in her first thunderstorm. That night, lying on her narrow cot in the cabin she shared with her 8-year-old daughter Sarah, Elena couldn't stop thinking about Nathaniel Cordova's quick departure. About the deed signed too fast. About the way his hands had trembled slightly when he'd handed over the pen. About the way the jailhouse seemed to breathe when no wind touched it, as if those 40 cents had not bought a structure at all, but something waiting inside it. 3 weeks before Elena Blackwood bought the jailhouse, she counted the coins in the mason jar hidden under the loose floorboard in her kitchen and knew she wouldn't make it through winter. $41 and some change stood between her and frozen ground. Between her and the kind of hunger that makes a woman consider things she swore she never would. Her cabin sat on 12 acres of mountain land that barely produced enough to feed her, Sarah, and Scout. Most nights she gave the largest portions to her daughter and the dog, eating just enough herself to keep working. The mine where her husband Marcus had worked had closed 2 years after his death in the cave-in. Most families had left Silverpine Crossing after that, chasing work in bigger towns. Elena was too stubborn or too poor to leave. Probably both. She was outside Brennan's mercantile when she overheard 2 miners talking. One said Nathaniel Cordova wanted to sell the old territorial jailhouse up on Hangman's Ridge. The other laughed and said nobody in their right mind would touch that cursed wreck. But Elena heard something else beneath the superstition. $300 in salvageable materials if a woman worked hard enough and wasn't afraid of rust and ghosts. She wasn't afraid of those things. She was afraid of Sarah going hungry. She was afraid of the winter cold. She was afraid of becoming one of those hollow-eyed women who disappeared into poverty so slowly that nobody noticed until they were gone. That evening, Elena found Nathaniel Cordova at the edge of town beside an elegant carriage loaded with expensive leather trunks. Cordova was in his late 60s, distinguished-looking with silver hair perfectly combed, wearing clothes that cost more than Elena would earn in 5 years. His eyes never quite met hers when he spoke, always sliding sideways like oil on water. Elena had learned to distrust men who couldn't look you in the eye. When Elena mentioned the jailhouse, Cordova went absolutely still for just a fraction of a second. Then his expression smoothed over like creek water after a stone settles. "You want to buy it?" His voice was cultured, educated. "Depends on the price," Elena said. 40 cents. Elena stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Property had value simply for existing, even ruined property. "I'm sorry, did you say?" 40 cents, Cordova repeated, already pulling the deed from his coat pocket, already holding out an expensive fountain pen. "Take it or leave it, Mrs. Blackwood. I want it gone. Off my conscience." That word, conscience, caught in Elena's mind like a fish hook. But she signed. She counted out 2 quarters from her precious jar money and placed them in Cordova's soft, manicured hand. He didn't count them. Didn't even look at them. He simply folded the deed, handed it to her with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly, and climbed into his carriage without another word. Elena stood alone on the dusty road, wondering what kind of secret pressed so heavy on a man's soul that he'd give away property like it was cursed. Elena returned to the jailhouse the next morning with Scout trotting beside her and a crowbar slung over her shoulder. She'd also brought a hammer, a canvas sack, and her late husband's old mining lantern. The walk took just over an hour through pine forest and across a dried creek bed. She hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Cordova's face, that momentary tightness around his mouth. Heard that word again, conscience. A wealthy man didn't sell property for 40 cents unless something was catastrophically wrong with it. Or unless something was very right with it, and he needed it gone before anyone else noticed which. The jailhouse looked worse in harsh morning light. The wood had weathered to the color of old bones. Rust covered every metal surface. Elena circled the structure twice, studying the frame with the practical eye of someone who'd helped build her own cabin. She looked for signs of collapse, for rot that would make salvage dangerous, for anything that would explain Cordova's desperation. The western wall leaned inward slightly, but the stone foundation looked surprisingly solid. That was strange. A building this old should have settled unevenly into the hillside. Scout stopped at the entrance, ears flat, body locked rigid. The dog stared into the darkness beyond the doorway and would not move forward. Would not respond to Elena's commands, which had never happened before. Elena crouched down and ran her hand through Scout's thick fur, feeling the tension there, the muscles drawn tight as fence wire. The dog was trembling. "It's just an old building," Elena said softly, but the words felt hollow. When she stepped across the threshold, she understood why Scout had refused. The air felt different here, heavier, denser, like breathing underwater. And the smell, that sharp metallic taste, was stronger now. It reminded her of the air after lightning strikes too close. Elena lit her lantern and held it high. The flame pushed back some of the darkness but made everything look worse. The walls were covered in water stains that formed patterns, dark marks that looked disturbingly like handprints, like dozens of people had pressed their palms against the wood and left their shadows behind. She moved deeper into the jailhouse, her boots echoing on the wooden floor with a sound that felt wrong. It should have been a simple thud. But instead, each step produced a hollow resonance that suggested vast empty space beneath the boards. Elena knelt and rapped her knuckles against the floor. The sound that came back was unmistakably hollow. There was space below where there should have been packed earth or stone foundation. Her chest tightened. She stood and walked to the back wall of what had been the largest cell. She knocked on the wall. Same hollow echo. Same empty sound where there should have been solid hillside. Elena pressed her shoulder against the wall and pushed. The boards gave slightly, flexing inward more than they should have. Old wood was supposed to be rigid, brittle. This felt almost soft, like the wall wasn't really a wall but something pretending to be one. She wedged her crowbar into a gap between two boards and pried with all her strength. The wood resisted, then suddenly gave with a crack that rang through the empty jailhouse like a gunshot. Scout barked once from outside, sharp, urgent, warning. Elena froze, lantern trembling in her grip. Behind the board she'd just torn away, there was no hillside. No packed earth. There was only darkness, a deep, unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow the lantern light. There was a space that shouldn't exist. A cavity carved into the hill itself, hidden behind a false wall constructed with deliberate care. And from somewhere deep within that darkness, Elena heard something that made her blood run ice cold. The faint but unmistakable sound of metal shifting against metal. Like coins being counted in the dark. Like something heavy settling after decades of absolute stillness. Like something that had been waiting 43 years to be discovered. Elena stood at the edge of the hidden space, lantern held forward with a trembling hand, heart hammering against her ribs. The light barely penetrated the darkness, but it was enough to see that this wasn't just a gap in the wall. This was deliberate. Someone had carved this space into the rock, had built a false wall to hide it, and had sealed it up so well that 43 years hadn't revealed its existence. She pushed more boards away, widening the opening until she could squeeze through. Scout whined from outside but didn't follow. Elena didn't blame her. The space beyond was maybe 12 feet deep, carved directly into the hillside. The walls were bare rock, cold enough to make her breath visible. And stacked against the far wall were 4 leather saddlebags, old and cracked but still intact. Elena's hands shook as she lifted the first one. It was heavy. Far heavier than old leather should be. She unbuckled the flap. Inside, gold coins caught the lantern light and threw it back in sharp, yellow glints. Double eagles, $20 gold pieces, dozens of them packed tight. She'd seen one once, years ago, in a banker's hand. Had never dreamed of holding even one. Now she was looking at dozens. She opened the second bag. More gold. The third held paper currency, old bills, treasury notes, bank certificates. The fourth bag was the heaviest. All gold. All coins. Elena sat back on her heels, staring at the bags, and felt the entire world tilt sideways. Her mind went blank for several seconds. Then thoughts rushed back. Whose money was this? How long had it been here? Why had Cordova sold the building for nothing? And the coldest question, if Cordova knew this was here, why did he let it go for 40 cents? What could scare a man more than losing a fortune? Elena dragged the bags out one at a time, her muscles straining. She stacked them inside the main jailhouse, hidden behind a collapsed wall, and stood there breathing hard while her mind raced. This much gold didn't just appear. This was outlaw money. Had to be. The territorial jailhouse had been built in the 1880s, back when gangs robbed trains and banks and disappeared into the mountains. This could be loot from any of a dozen notorious robberies that had never been solved. And if Cordova knew it was here, then he'd sold Elena a fortune for 40 cents because something had scared him more than losing $14 million. She worked quickly after that, searching for anything else hidden in the cavity. She found it wedged into a crack in the rock, a metal box, small and rusted. Inside were papers. Letters written in faded ink. Documents yellowed with age. And as Elena read them by lantern light, the full horror of what she'd stumbled into began to take shape. These were confessions. Written testimony from members of the Carson Ridge Raiders, the most notorious outlaw gang in territorial history. They'd robbed banks across 3 territories, killed at least a dozen people, and disappeared in 1882 after their biggest heist, $300,000 in gold from a railroad payroll. $300,000 that had never been recovered. Elena was holding it in her hands. But the confessions told a darker story. These men had been caught, imprisoned in this jailhouse, and sentenced to hang. Before their execution, they'd written everything down. And scattered among their confessions were other documents that made Elena's hands shake. Property deeds. Transfer papers. Business contracts. All bearing the same name, Nathaniel Cordova. The papers told a story that made Elena's blood turn to ice. The Carson Ridge raiders had help. A young lawyer named Nathaniel Cordova had defended them, had promised to use their stolen money to bribe judges and buy their freedom. Instead, he'd let them hang and kept the fortune for himself, or tried to. The outlaws had been smarter. They'd hidden the money where even their lawyer couldn't find it, had written confessions that implicated him, and had sealed both fortune and evidence behind this false wall. A final revenge against the man who'd betrayed them. For 43 years, Cordova had built a legitimate empire on blood money. He'd become one of the wealthiest men in the territory. And for 43 years, he'd lived in fear that someone would find this jailhouse and discover the truth. That's why he'd sold it for 40 cents. He knew about the documents. Knew that someday, someone might find proof of crimes that would destroy everything he'd built. And now Elena held that proof in her trembling hands. ACT 5, the confrontation. Elena was still reading the confessions when she heard the horse outside. She looked up sharply and saw Nathaniel Cordova standing in the jailhouse doorway, his tall frame blocking the sunlight. He looked different now. Harder. Colder. More dangerous. His eyes went directly to the saddlebags stacked against the wall. Then to the papers in Elena's hands. She watched the color drain from his face. Found something interesting, Mrs. Blackwood? Just old papers, Elena said, keeping her tone casual. Property records mostly. Cordova stepped inside, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Scout's growl from outside grew louder. Elena felt the weight of Marcus's old pistol tucked into her belt. Cordova stopped about 15 feet away. Those belong to me. They were in the jailhouse. The jailhouse belongs to me now. Something dangerous flickered across Cordova's face. I'll buy it back. $1,000. Cash. Today. $1,000. More money than Elena would see in 10 years. Enough to fix her cabin, buy supplies for years, send Sarah to school. But she looked down at the confession letters, at the testimony written by dying men who'd named Cordova as their accomplice. At the proof that would destroy one of the most powerful men in the territory. Not interested, Elena said quietly. 5,000 then. Desperation crept into his voice. $5,000, Mrs. Blackwood. You could buy a house in Denver. Never worry about money again. 5,000. The number was impossibly large. But she saw the desperation in Cordova's eyes now, saw his composure cracking. Why did the Carson Ridge raiders trust you? Elena asked. These letters say you promised to save them. Instead, you let them hang and kept everything. Cordova's jaw clenched. You don't understand what you're dealing with. People in this territory have long memories. They remember women who make trouble. They remember what happens to troublemakers and their families. The threat hung in the air. Elena's hand moved toward the pistol. Are you threatening my daughter? I'm warning you, Cordova said coldly. I've spent 40 years building my reputation. I'm not going to let some desperate widow destroy it. Take the 5,000 and disappear. Or stay and discover exactly how much power I have. Elena stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not a gentleman but a predator who'd been feeding on the weak for decades. I think you should leave, Elena said. Now. Cordova's eyes went flat. You have until sunset tomorrow. After that, accidents happen. Houses catch fire. Children go missing. Do you understand me? He turned and walked out. Elena waited until she couldn't hear anything. Then she sat down hard on the floor. Scout came running inside, pressing against her leg. Elena understood with absolute certainty that she had just made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the territory. ACT 6, The Journey to Justice. Elena spent the rest of the day working with desperate focus. She couldn't take the gold, too heavy, too conspicuous. But she could take the documents. She wrapped them in oilcloth, then canvas, and tucked everything into a leather satchel. She hid the gold deeper in the cavity, then rebuilt the false wall, scattering debris to make it look undisturbed. But she couldn't do this alone. She needed allies. People who had been hurt by Cordova. She started with Margaret Chen, whose husband had died in suspicious circumstances after refusing to sell his mine to Cordova. Then Frank Delacroix, who'd lost his ranch to Cordova in a rigged card game. Then Iris Wakefield, whose father had been Cordova's business partner until he'd fallen from a hotel window. By midnight, Elena had gathered 9 people in her small cabin. 9 people who'd lost too much to Cordova's greed. The marshal's office in Copper Hill is 3 days' ride, Elena said, laying the documents on her table. These papers prove Cordova built his fortune on stolen gold and murder. If we can get them there, we might have a chance. He'll come after us, Margaret Chen said quietly. He's already threatened me, Elena said. This is happening whether we want it to or not. They left before dawn, 9 riders and 1 dog moving through the darkness. Elena rode in the middle, the satchel strapped tight across her chest. Sarah was safe with the pastor's family. They made it 20 miles before Cordova's men found them. 8 riders came out of the trees at the river crossing, blocking the trail. Elena recognized 3 of them, hired guns from Denver. Mrs. Blackwood, their leader, called out. Mr. Cordova asks that you reconsider his generous offer. Tell Mr. Cordova his offer is rejected, Elena called back, her hand moving to her pistol. The shooting started before he finished speaking. Elena fired first. Then everything dissolved into chaos, gunshots echoing, horses screaming, Scout attacking with savage efficiency. Frank Delacroix went down in the first volley. Margaret Chen took a bullet in the leg but kept firing. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Cordova's men lay dead or dying. The rest had fled. They buried Frank in the hills, said words that felt too small for his sacrifice. Then they rode on. 3 days later, they reached Copper Hill. The marshal's office represented everything Silverpine Crossing wasn't: law that worked, justice that mattered. Elena laid the documents on the marshal's desk. Marshal Porter was a gray-haired man with hard eyes and harder principles. He read every page. Every confession. Every deed. Then he looked up at Elena. This is enough to hang him. If it's authentic. It's authentic, Elena said. Written by dying men with nothing left to lose. Then Nathaniel Cordova's empire is finished. Epilogue, Justice and Fortune. It took 6 months for the legal proceedings to unfold. Cordova fought with everything he had. But the evidence was ironclad, and Marshal Porter was incorruptible. In the end, Nathaniel Cordova was convicted of fraud, theft, accessory to murder, and a dozen other crimes. His properties were seized. His fortune was dismantled. And the gold? The courts ruled that since the original owners were dead and their heirs couldn't be located, and since the money was recovered from property Elena legally owned, she was entitled to claim it. $14 million. Elena used the money carefully. She bought a proper house in Copper Hill for herself and Sarah. She established a school for minors' children. She gave portions to the victims' families. She helped rebuild Silverpine Crossing. And she kept the jailhouse, that 40-cent purchase that had changed everything. Sometimes late at night, she'd sit on her porch with Scout at her feet and think about those 2 quarters. About impossible deals and hidden fortunes. About courage that cost everything and justice that paid back more. 40 cents had bought her a jailhouse. But courage had bought her justice. And that, Elena decided, was worth infinitely more than gold.